You are listening to Cemetery Confessions, the world's #1 goth talk podcast.
Hello and welcome back to Cemetery Confessions. On this episode, we're talking to Gerard, the frontman of the band Second Salem. He was recently featured in the winter issue of Auxiliary Magazine, as well as being the cover model. We're going to be talking about the state of goth music today and the state of goth today, as well as what it's like to live in the world and to be part of the goth community when you are what would be labeled as the other, which encompasses gender identity, neurodivergence, and an acceptance of death, among other things. We also have a review of the album of Ruination by the band The Palace of Tears. As always, I am Danny Ashes, and I'm here with my co-host Trey. Gerard, introduce yourself. Let us know where you first were introduced to goth and what it was about goth that attracted you, captured your attention to hold you and connect you over time with that community.
Okay. I grew up, my dad was around for the majority of like my early childhood and then like my later teens, but throughout most of his life, he was goth. And so I kind of grew up around the media. Like I remember at one point, like I was literally going to bed every night watching Night of the Living Dead with my dad, just hanging out. Like horror movies were a big thing in the house. I grew up listening to Susie and the Banshees with him all of the time. He was also a musician. So he played the electric guitar in like probably 3 or 4 bands throughout the time that I was growing up in like my formative years. And, you know, sometimes practice would be somewhere else and we'd have to go like drop him off and I'd get to like go in and check out the space, or like he would have band practice at the house and I would get to like actually experience that. So I was constantly surrounded by different facets of goth media through my dad. And, you know, now that I look back, I'm like, wow, I was so lucky. That was super cool. I wish I took more of an advantage of it. But, you know, as a teenager, I was very much like, well, goth is stupid because my dad is into it. I'm gonna be emo.
Yeah.
That's, I think, the terror of every goth parent.
I'm sure my kid's going to be super into baseball. It's going to drive me crazy, but I'm going to have to love it.
And that's why I'm only having dogs.
Yeah.
Your dog will refuse to fetch any bones. Only frisbees and hacky sacks, nothing else.
I'll take it. But I think over time as I grew up, like I've never really left that whole emo thing behind. Like even while I was waiting for this to start, I'm like sitting here listening to My Chemical Romance and Beartooth, jamming, waiting for this to start. I think in a lot of ways, kind of having that rebellious era of like, fuck you, dad, I'm not going to do your thing, has kind of made me love goth more. Because I have more of a respect for where the musicians that I really got attached to came from, because so many of them are influenced by all of these older goth artists that my dad was super into. And I think once I started like really like finding myself and developing my own style, it was kind of that urge to go back to my roots and kind of grow up a little bit. You know, goth's more classy than emo is.
Yes.
In a lot of ways.
Yeah.
So I feel like it was kind of a natural progression of like the states of alternative. But I do wish that I had bothered my dad about stuff more.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you don't know, like, you don't know until you know. What My Chem were you listening to?
I was listening to Sleep.
Okay.
Off of the Black Parade album.
Yeah. I had an emo phase. I don't talk about it on the podcast.
Yes, you do.
But
don't say that. You definitely talk about it on the podcast.
Every once
Usually in the same terms of how you don't talk about it, but still.
Yeah, it was. Let's see. That was probably around 2000, end of 2005 to 2007, maybe 2006.
The prime years.
Yeah, that was. I was just trying new stuff out, doing some. It was big. Everybody was on MySpace doing the top-down selfies and all that shit. Well, cool. That's awesome to hear. So you kind of answered the other question, which is about how did pursuing music develop? I don't know if you have anything else you wanted to add to that.
Oh, yeah. My dad actually was not very supportive of me doing music for a very long time, which I think pushed me into it a little bit harder. And I think his perspective on it was more like, I'm a musician and I've seen how difficult this is, and I don't want you to struggle in the same ways that I have.
Yeah. Which
as an adult now makes sense to me. But as a kid, I'm like, well, what the fuck? Like, you do this. What the fuck's wrong with you? But I really think that made me want to do it like 10 times harder. And now, like, I call my dad before every show that we have, and I'm like, hey, I'm doing that thing you said I shouldn't do. And he's like super supportive, and he loves all my bandmates. And it's really cool to see that that's, flipped. I think it's because he knows that, like, he can't tell me no, because I'm just going to do it anyway. But he came around, and that's what's important.
What are you most interested in doing for music? Obviously, you perform vocals with Second Salem, but do you noodle around with a bunch of different things? Or?
I guess my big push lately for my band really is to kind of like up our theatrics. Like, I came from a very musical theater background. I did probably like 10 years worth of musical theater throughout all my time in school. And then like I did Shakespearean acting for a while, and that was really fun, and I really dug that. And I feel like I've been thinking about this a lot because I literally saw Ghost for my birthday like 2 days ago, and they put on by far one of like my favorite stage performances ever. And I remember having like these like all these really cool ideas and these cool concepts, and I was like, I want to do this stuff, but like this is so weird and no one's ever gonna fucking get this. Like, this is so stupid. Like, why bother? I'm just gonna play in a band and be another shitty band dude. But seeing, all of these relatively newer artists kind of come out and push the envelope a little more is kind of inspired me in a lot of ways to start like really amping shit up.
Besides Ghost, any other particular touchstones for, I guess, theatricality and inspiration in that avenue?
Well, I mean, I guess My Chemical Romance would be a big one. There was that one show that they did fairly early into Revenge where they like brought a bunch of like ballet dancers out onto the stage and like literally had them perform the entire Helena music video. I know I've heard that In This Moment has a really interesting stage performance that's super theatrical, and I've never seen them, but my girlfriend has quite a few times. She always says that they're really, really good.
Mm-hmm. It's funny. I have I'll send this to you later, but I made an emo playlist on Spotify with music that no one puts in their emo playlists, because there's obviously a bunch of emo playlists, but nothing that there's a bunch of songs that I listen to of that in that era that I don't see get a lot of representation in other playlists. So maybe that would be fun to send. No one gives a shit about it. Everybody,
I give a shit.
Okay, good. Awesome. Well, let me ask you about music being hard then, because for the last few years on the podcast, we've talked about how the goth music scene is exploding with bands from all over the world in all sorts of genres. And it's good in a way because it seems like people are more excited about goth in general because the music has had such a renaissance. But I wonder, though, as a relatively newer band, if that's made it difficult and sort of how you're approaching getting your music out there and kind of fitting into the landscape of alternative and goth music.
I don't know if we've had much of a struggle when it comes to that specifically. Though when we do, finally later this year, put our first single out, I am pretty interested to see how that develops for us, because I feel like once we actually have something to put out onto the scene, things are going to get kind of weird. As they do.
Mm-hmm.
Do you let me ask you about singles too, because there's that kind of I've heard kind of both sides of people saying, well, you should only put out singles because nobody listens to full albums anymore, and it's easier to maintain relevance because you can put music out more often. And then I've heard people argue that full albums are better. Do you have a personal preference, and do you have a preference for what you think you should do as a band?
That's tough because I really do see both sides of it. Like we're taking the approach of releasing a couple singles and skipping the whole like EP thing, and then the idea is to release a full album. I usually, when I find a band that I really like, because I'm not an album person, I'm a song person. It takes a lot for me to like really get into an artist and listen to a full album. But once I find an artist that I like really want to sink my teeth into, I just want to consume as much as possible. But at the same time, like I like that tease of having to wait for the next album and like just really allowing myself to be immersed in what has been put out and fall in love with that while I'm waiting for the next thing, instead of like feeling like this need to hurry up and consume.
Yeah.
So I don't know, like I'm kind of all over the place with it, but I personally would much rather put out an album and then be able to like kind of expand on the world building with music videos and other forms of art that are connected to that media than constantly be worrying about pushing out the next single.
Right. I guess it's kind of maybe it's more how you approach it, whether it's more of a, well, I would hope all music is a passion project, but if it's more for the art itself, or if you're more concerned, if it's your primary job, if you're more concerned about how many people are seeing this, when am I going to get paid, how much am I going to get paid, how do I make money off of it, I guess that raises new concerns.
Right. For me, music has never been about the money. It's been about the love of the art and just being able to have an outlet and create stuff. So, even if this song we put out is super successful and it does a lot, like that's cool, but that's not why I'm here. So like, I don't care. Like I'm still going to live off of ramen. It's fine.
An interesting possibility that I was thinking of somewhat recently about the whole music release model and the single versus LP paradigm is kind of looking back to an old paradigm from publishing from like the 19th century, where a lot of works were serialized. They'd take a whole novel, break it into chunks, and release it as serialized chapters. And you could do that with sort of a story album. And you could even do that almost with what you were saying, Gerard, with the mixed media, where you have other things, the videos. Yeah. You can release something as a story, so it's got an arc like an LP does, but it's being released as, here's an album, here's a video, here's some photo shoot, here's maybe a little like liner note story, lyrical blurb, and do that progressively, and it builds up. And people are still waiting for that next thing because it's chronologically based, or at least it calls back to the previous element. So it's not fully digestible in it's a bunch of standalone singles with no relation to each other, but it's not, hey, I need to wait 2 years for the next album, which is the problem in today's Spotify world, where people don't want to wait that long. They want that constant drip, or you just sort of fall off the radar.
Right, absolutely. And I think that there's a very likely possibility that that's kind of where artists and how they go about putting things out, like how that's going to be the progression of things, or at least I would hope so, because you have, when you put something out on Spotify, people usually find out about that through other social media platforms. So if you're utilizing that and building off of everything, like every platform that you have, you can really do a lot.
To me, it seems a lot of artists are doing more the sort of parasocial way, where they're not necessarily creating a work of an alternate reality or an alternate, thing like that. They're just letting people into their lives, giving them their Instagram feed of, hey, I did this and we went here and here's some shots of us in the studio. And here's me out walking my dog, that sort of get people to invest in you as a person, and then through that leverage that to music, which is of course another fine way, and that's been very popular for a lot of people, the whole influencer social media aspect. But I think it ties in less well with, especially if you want to go down a more theatrical bent, you are kind of putting on a character then. And yes, you could create a character Instagram where you're doing an entirely manufactured life. That's the lifestyle of character X from album Y, as an option. But I don't know. I think something like the serialized where it's all this in-world media is a more interesting way.
Yeah, no, Gerard, you kind of do that. You do your makeup streams on TikTok and that kind of stuff.
Oh yeah, I mean, I definitely enjoy, letting people see more of a human side to me. But something that I feel like I end up telling like a lot of the people that I make friends with on my live streams, or like when I'm talking about my band on live, is like, I don't. How do I phrase this in a way that makes sense without coming off like a douchebag? I don't want people to be invested in my band because they think my makeup is cool or because they think that I'm a cool guy. I want them to be invested in my band because they like the music, they like the art, they're interested in what's happening. Like, yeah, okay, I look cool. I'm a funny guy sometimes, whatever. You can thirst over me. I don't give a shit. But I want people to listen to my music and be invested in the emotion that it gives them, the story behind, what's being talked about, and not just another pretty face.
Yeah. No, I totally understand that. That makes perfect sense.
Yeah. And that can always be a challenge. I've heard plenty of artists, lament over when, they have this public persona that's, for whatever reason, they got notoriety, whether it was because they are fabulous looking or have this great stage presence or a fashion icon, but their true passion is their songcraft, and they're frustrated when their songcraft gets sidelined by all these, spreads in some fashion magazine.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I would be lying if I didn't say that I'm grateful for the following that I've built on my own, because I love everybody that I interact with, and I love the community that I've become a part of. But I, at this point in my life, I would probably be happier if I lost half of my followers and they went all over to follow the band stuff and to see what's going on with that, because that to me is the most important part of my life. I don't wake up every day and do my makeup. I wake up every day and I'm jumping out of bed singing. Like, that's what I do. Music is everything to me.
Well, on that theatricality aspect of things, I've been thinking about, I've been sort of digesting. Trey and I were just on a discussion panel for a design museum. And during that discussion, there were questions in chat. And this topic was brought up by the panelists, where people were trying to pull apart the sinews of goth, with the idea being that there's a variety of elements that congeal into something recognizable. So as I was kind of thinking about that, trying to see if we could tease apart a little of Second Salem, and sort of, if you're trying to distill specific themes or aesthetics into this cohesive music and presentation, and what those themes and musings are.
Oh, wow. I'm sorry. That's a lot. And I'm really going to have to think about this for a second. I'm sorry.
No, that's fine.
I mean, I guess, with our name alone, Second Salem, that immediately, to a lot of people brings up, the idea of the witch trials and witches and magic in general. And I know that usually the occult and goth are kind of looked at as being hand-in-hand things. Maybe that's just my experience too, in growing up with a parent that was not only a goth, but was also a magical practitioner. Like, that to me has always been a connection. I think as far as our like our outward aesthetics go and the way that we look and like the visuals that we present. We do a lot of like cemetery imagery. We have like tombstones that we bring around with us that we've like
excellent
painted and custom designed. We have like candles everywhere. We're working on making more candles, and as we build up our theatrics, kind of adding more of a flair of that nighttime kind of chilling out in your dungeon vibe.
Hell yeah.
Yeah. I mean, we all wear black. I know that's not really like necessary. Sometimes our bassist will wear purple. Whatever, it's fine.
It's a vibe.
Oh, for sure.
I'm very supportive of purple.
He looks damn good doing it.
I'll never complain when someone puts on a lot of purple.
The idea that 3 out of our 5 band members are all occultists that practice in the same coven together kind of lends more to us taking a magical approach to things rather than like a classical goth kind of approach to it. But I would say that we have a large amount of gothic elements into what we do, and that I only foresee that growing.
In what way do you mean? Do you infuse sort of ritual and that sort of thing into preparation or into the music itself, or how does that magic sort of manifest in Second Salem?
So I like to look at every song that we write as being a spell. And lately I've been taking spells that I write for other things and fusing those into lyrics. I love that. Kind of, so there's a song that we just created, like we literally just wrote it on the fly out of a jam session like 2 practices ago, called Meet the Void. And it's actually kind of there's a lot of lines in it that kind of allude to the Giles Corey situation. But the bridge of the piece is a spell that I wrote for breaking bonds and like kind of being able to uplift yourself more instead of feeling weighed down by things. So I would say very literally we write magic into our music.
I mean, I feel like, I guess depending on your tradition, music is really close to a spell already anyway.
Absolutely. I mean, lyrics have intent, right? And even if you're doing a completely instrumental piece, the way that music makes you feel and that emotion behind it, that is very magical.
Yeah, I know. I've never been to a what is the band? I'm not going to be able to remember now. The Satanist band that's like they're a duo and they're like jazzy.
Temple?
Yeah. They do like literal actual like ritual and stuff during their sets, don't they? I haven't been to their.
I did not get to see them. So they were opening for Ghost when I went to see them, but we showed up with like 5 minutes to spare before Ghost went on. Totally worth it. Like it's fine. I'll catch them next tour, whatever. It's fine. But I have heard that like they actually craft rituals into their stage performance, and that is something that we've kind of talked loosely about doing with our own stage performances. And actually at our last show that we did for my birthday, our rhythm guitarist actually led everybody in a Baphomet's cross, which was super cool. And I would love to be able to, kind of, even if it's slowly, just little by little, put a bit more of that into it. And I really love the kind of like crowd interaction that stuff gives too.
In relation to drawing on a variety of themes, from now, obviously my exposure to your music is through YouTube and places like that. But
I'm so sorry. All those videos are so old. Like, we sound nothing like that anymore. And I don't know why they're still up. It's because I don't have access to any of those accounts.
Oh, okay, I got you.
My only influence so far has been on Instagram since after we had you on here, I looked you up and found some of your Instagram things, which I think are a little bit newer. At least it sounded like they were newer.
I know there's like one clip on the band's Instagram that's relatively new.
It was like,
but I think that's about.
I think that's the main one I watched. It was like a 20-minute clip, and you were saying it's right around the first time back after, I assume, the pandemic.
Yes.
Yeah. Yep. So that's the main one I've seen. So that's sort of my yardstick of what your music's like.
Well, maybe this question is irrelevant then, but what I was thinking about was it sound, from what I could hear, it sounded like you were doing a lot of mixing with genre rather than being straight up in, we are a rock band or a goth band or whatever. And so I wanted to ask you, because there's been a lot of debate around what should and shouldn't fall under the goth music umbrella. And so I wanted to ask if you had opinions on, or even cared about, genre classification and ways to keep music fresh and interesting while still maintaining a sort of, I guess, recognizability.
I do have feelings on it, yes, but I'm not sure how these are going to be taken. I don't personally really care about genre. I've always been the kind of person that's like, if I like it, I like it. I'm not going to limit what I listen to just because it doesn't fit in with my aesthetic. And I think that the only way that we can really keep music interesting and new and evolving is by trying different things and adding different elements. I'm definitely one of those people that believes, like, in order to be considered a goth, you have to listen to goth music. But how we define that, I think, to a large degree, is on a very individual basis. Like, obviously, you have your tried and your true and your classics and things that are indisputably goth. But when it comes to like modern bands or like newer artists that are coming out, as these artists come out and evolve, so will and so does any subculture that is tied to them.
Yeah, I think I've said it a couple of times on this podcast, but I've always viewed genre as a very important factor to be taken in a descriptive sense, but it should never be viewed in a proscriptive sense. It's not, you must be this or
Absolutely.
that. It's a good way to have a shorthand as a musician. Like, hey, I'd like this drum to have a little bit more of a metal sound or a little bit more of a jazz sound, just as a sort of a sonic touchstone, or for guitar tone, or for vocal stylings, things like that. There are genre tropes that are useful to communicate that to another person as you're communicating amongst each other in the band. And then from a marketing and sales standpoint, it's useful for the listening public to know, hey, if you are into this genre, this band has elements of this or elements of that, rather than, oh, you're no good because you're not genre X enough. It's not about that. It's about, hey, this band mixes a little bit of metalcore or with a little bit of goth, with a little bit of synthwave, whatever. It's useful for descriptive, and it's definitely something that I look into as a music consumer when I'm trying to find something I like, and like, this is interesting. What would this fit under, or what is this like? So I can find other stuff like it. And then when I create music, I like genres as a way of saying, I kind of like this sound. I want to sort of dig in to see how it works so I can take it apart and put it together with other things and mix it with other things, because I do like genre hybridization. And I think that's really important for the progress of music, which is why I tend to be very frustrated when it comes to genre purists who, this genre can only be thus, and any deviation from this formula is anathema and needs to be thrown away.
Yeah.
I don't know if I could have said that better. Absolutely.
Well, and I really like what you said about partially being an individual process, because I think people have this idea, and Trey, you could probably speak to the canon aspect of things, but people have this idea of there being a fixed canon for whatever group, without realizing that is built both in a communal discourse and from an individual experiential perspective. And you just have to look at the sort of whenever those lists of top 10 goth albums or top 50 foundational goth albums or industrial or any genre, you just have to look at the comment section to see all the people who think they know better telling everyone else why they're wrong, right? So it is, it's built over time and through. It's this fluid thing, and there might be a broader community agreement, but there is, I think, some room for individual expression of that. Mm-hmm. Did you have something to say, Trey? Or because I have some other thoughts, but
I mean, not a whole lot. That pretty much summarizes what my feelings towards canon is. I mean, canon is oftentimes something that's imposed upon a body of work, right? It's rarely the artists themselves who are making things to be a part of a canon. They're not compiling, let's make this song so it can fit this slot in this canon of genre. It's usually fandoms, music press, labels, depending on the genre, that are sort of defining these canons by what they choose to produce, what they choose to put out there, what they choose to buy or consume, depending on what side of the equation they're on. And then that develops and accretes over time based on just what sticks and what doesn't. And that is sort of how genres are created as well. Usually, when genres first start, it's rarely the bands that are creating the genre. In fact, the bands are usually complaining about it. It's the outsiders or the fans that are cohering around it and then creating this genre from just their interaction with the artwork. There are some exceptions of this. There are certainly some genres of music, some overarching genres of music that tend to work a little bit more where the artists seem to be trying to create new genres. I'm thinking of more like electronic music tends to have artists that try to make genres and make genres a thing. Metal can do that a lot of times too, though metal is sort of half and half. Some bands hate the genres and want to kick them all out and hate that they're shoehorned, and some bands just, I want to create a new gore, grind, death, softcore genre that, this is my thing and I'm owning this one very, very unique singular genre. And that seems to be, at least in my experience with various music genres, it seems that electronic and metal music seems to be the ones that are most prone to artists kind of creating them. But outside of that, it's a lot of sort of organic creation, just by categorizing works that sound similar or bands that have influenced one another through the course of their existence.
Yeah. So going back to the sort of what you brought up, Gerard, about listening to goth music being part of what makes you goth. I don't know. I might go on a bit of a rant here, so I apologize in advance if I'm overly wordy.
It's what we expect of you.
I think I guess I'm just more self-conscious right tonight for various reasons. But I think for me, from a listener perspective, I think, well, first of all, there will always be people who listen to non-goth music and dress goth or vice versa. And some of them will describe themselves as goth and some of them won't. And there's always been music that is clearly not goth that gets described or called goth by certain people. I remember there was an article we covered, I think this was long before you were on the podcast, Trey, but it was about how Katy Perry's song Dark Horse was part of a goth revival.
Well, yeah, it's got dark in the name. Duh.
Yeah. Just absurd, right? And a more recent example, I think, would be the band that I like to use is the band Pale Waves, as part of that not goth but labeled goth phenomenon, just because they use a goth aesthetic, but when you listen to their music, it's pop music. So, but to that end, I don't think kids that say they think Evanescence or Billie Eilish, or I don't have a more modern reference off the top of my head because I'm not cool anymore, whatever, is a goth band. I don't think they're taking anything away from the scene. I think there's always going to be that area outside of what you could call goth proper where you've got people trying to use elements of goth in something new, or people just trying to find themselves and develop their identity. And then there's a separate issue of writers and media outlets using keywords like goth for clicks. I get in my Google alerts, I get shit tons of those. And it's clear they're just like, Daily Mail and whatever. They're just making up whatever nonsense to drive people to their website for ad revenue. In general, though, I think those things end up being disconnected from goth spaces and communities. Or sometimes what you were talking to, it's that mixing leads to a future music trend and sort of influences goth later on. I think one of the biggest disappointments for me, well, maybe this could kind of be an example of what I'm talking about too, but Witch House, which it didn't really end up going anywhere or sticking around, at least as part of the goth scene. But I thought there were some really incredibly goth Witch House tracks that did something really interesting with that sound. But I guess that's also kind of what I'm saying is people were freaked out about it and lost their minds about it. And then it went away and people moved on to the next thing to freak out about. And it didn't, nobody talks about Witch House anymore, right, in the goth scene. And so it either goes on to something else or it filters into something new, and goth sort of takes it through that lens and makes something new with it that makes sense. The other issue, I think, is people get upset by explicitly goth signifiers being used by outsiders. And I think, I guess I get the impulse for that. On the other hand of that, I think it also makes sense that goths would appreciate those signifiers being incorporated into other things that they love. An example from my personal life would be nerd stuff. I know it's not really a in vogue or part of the goth zeitgeist anymore, but for a long time there, nerd culture and goths engaging with that and mixing with that was a big thing, at least in my experience of the scene. Like you had Vampire the Masquerade, for example. You couldn't go to a goth club and throw a rock without hitting a Vampire the Masquerade LARPer. I think there was a phrase that was like, Vampire the Masquerade is bridge for goths. Stuff like Call of Cthulhu board games, or even just I would see a lot of like goth meetups at anime conventions and stuff, and people being excited about like from when I was reading manga, like what was her name from a Death Note, Miss Amane or something like that.
Misa, Misa Mane.
That like people were really excited about that. So it kind of, I think people are really selective. Like, okay, for example, last episode we talked about people being mad about trap and hip hop using goth signifiers and why that's a problem. And maybe this is a good example too, because I never really saw that sort of anger directed at companies or small teams of people that were making these nerdy and geeky products and using goths as part of that I see directed towards trap and hip hop using goth signifiers. And I think the very obvious difference there is that nerd culture is associated with whiteness and trap and rap is associated with blackness, right? Yep. Which is a big problem. And I actually I saw a TikTok video the other day, which was it was a clip of a YouTuber, and I don't know who it was, but he was talking about in the metal community how there's a problem with people will get really mad when somebody outside of the scene that is black is wearing a metal shirt, and they'll say they're a poser and they shouldn't like fake enjoying metal. But when it's a white guy with skinny white guy with tattoos, everybody's like thinks it's the coolest thing. So it just feels like there's that increased scrutiny on black culture, which is a problem. And
bullshit.
Yeah. You like, I mean, I did hear people complain about pale waves, but it was really fleeting, and I had to look hard to find it. They sort of look like the South Park goths, and then when you actually turn on their music,
I have no idea who these people are.
You should look them up because it's really jarring. If you look up them and then listen to the music, I'm not saying it's bad. It's just not what you would expect.
Gotcha.
But nobody was pissed really about it, and it's a bunch of white British people. So I think, for me, I've lived long enough to see goth used semiotically from fashion to music and all these different things that aren't part of the scene without it detracting from what goth is. So I think maybe it's a better use of time to talk. If you're worried about people, and I've said this before, if you're worried about people confusing what isn't goth for what is goth, maybe talk about what goth is rather than sort of defining it negatively against other things. So yeah, I don't know. That's my rant.
So I'm looking. I look Pale Waves up, and they definitely, the goth aesthetic is definitely there. So my biggest question, I guess, is like, are these like quote unquote normal people taking the goth aesthetic and using it, or is this a group of goth people that are just not making goth music? And where do we draw the line there?
I get the importance of the distinction. But yeah, I don't know. I watched like 2 or 3 of their interviews, but they were before they played festivals. So
gotcha.
And they did mention like, oh yeah, we love The Cure, but there wasn't much more to that.
Yeah,
I sorry.
Okay, go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say, like, I struggled to find anybody that doesn't like The Cure.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. Good point.
I don't know how much of a difference that makes, but like, that's cool, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, The Cure is also sort of a bad touchstone for a goth thing too, because what era of The Cure are you talking about? They're a very long-lived band that really changed their sound over the course of their existence. And while one could argue there's been sort of a goth core in most of their music, it definitely ebbed and flowed as far as how much of it was projected out there into the music in the overt sense. But yeah, I don't know anything about Pale Waves. I looked
You're
up
right. It is kind of a Rorschach test.
Yeah, I mean, I looked up Pale Waves on Wikipedia, and it does have a music style group, and it does name check Cocteau Twins, but it also name checks Prince, Alanis Morissette, and Avril Lavigne. So it definitely seems like they're a grouping of many different genre touchstones, from dream pop to the and synth pop on the sort of goth adjacent side of things, to indie rock and pop punk. So they're definitely a mix of things. But I don't know anything about them other than just their Wikipedia page.
About that. I don't want to go off too much on that. Oh, you know what? Let me say one more thing. Not about them. Let me say one more quick thing before I ask you another question, because I was thinking about this, and actually I kind of brought this up in a video that Trey and I did, but just on the sort of people being mad at other people using goth stuff that aren't goth. When I was in grade school and middle school, the goth kids, the emo kids, the alternative kids, the black kids, the punk kids, all of us were bullied, and it wasn't as bad when I was in school as it had been, but it was still prevalent, and we all lived close to each other, and so we all kind of bonded over that, and it formed this sort of, obviously there were kids, so there were rivalries and things, but in general, it formed this idea that it didn't matter what scene you were in, we shared a bond. And through that bond, then we all kind of shared our culture with each other. So nerd stuff and different kinds of music and different kinds of clothing. And it was this really beautiful, just communal experience. And so I think if that is where we should focus, rather than directing energy towards each other, negative energy towards each other and like infighting. The thing that I said on the video was that what we should be mad at is those associations of goth fashion with celebrity and capitalism. Right? All those articles about
Absolutely.
Kim Kardashian goes goth or insert celebrity goes goth.
That shit makes my head hurt.
Yeah, like I think you could read that as recuperation, which is when the ruling class co-ops the narrative of what something is, in this case goth. They try to take it and align it with market value and spending capital and celebrity excess, because what that does is then removes the transgression and new ways of being in the world, or that kind of working class solidarity of everyone being in it together, and moves it away from that towards something that's mediated and moderated by capitalism. So instead of sharing community between subcultures, we're fighting each other. And I think that's what this anger over trap and rap artists feels like to me. So, I don't know. All right. Well, so let me ask you a question. Oh yeah. Well, let's go back to Satanism then, because speaking of sort of ways of being in the world, and you know, I'm always interested in the ways our environment and community play a part in bringing forth our identity. I would love to hear how Satanism or witchcraft, or however you would describe your practice, has informed and supported you.
Okay, so this yet again goes back to my childhood. My father, while I was growing up, did practice Satanism, and I was never really around his practices, but I was definitely raised with satanic morals. I didn't really experience anything to do with the church until I was living full-time with my mother, and that's a whole long story I'm not going to get into. It's awful. There's songs about it. You can listen to it. But once I was out living on my own, and when I ended up moving back to Michigan for a second time, that's kind of when the idea of like spiritual journey kind of came about for me. Because up to that point, it was not really something that I'd ever paid too much attention to. And then I started kind of hanging out with different kinds of people that I didn't expect to ever end up hanging out with. For instance, like our old drummer, his family was like super Christian, like bad. They're great people, don't get me wrong, but they were very religious, and it hindered a lot of what we did with our music and how we presented ourselves as a band because of it. And it really got me thinking, like, you know, just about my beliefs and how they impacted me, and how the way that I was raised, you know, kind of guided me through the world. And I decided that, like, even if I didn't end up like practicing it, I wanted to understand it more than just from what I had read in books that I had borrowed from my dad or whatever. So long story short, I ended up, through friends of friends, getting in touch with this group called Satan House, that is an active satanic coven that runs in Detroit that I'm now a part of. And my best friend, my guitarist Kyle, and we ended up going to check out one of their events, and it was almost immediately like, yeah, this is the real shit. This is literally what I've read about in books, and it's happening before me. There has to be more to this. Like, I need to understand this more. And in making friendships with these people and talking to them about their beliefs and getting to actually like be a part of rituals, I realized that like this is something that I was very called to. And I guess I'm kind of weird about talking too much about my practice, because I'm super against people that are like, you need to hear all about my religion. Like, I'm not into that. My practice for me is very private, and I don't even really talk to my partner about my practices because, and it's not that we don't share the same beliefs by any means, but it's that we prefer to keep that to ourselves. Like, my relationship with what I believe in is not for anybody else. It's for me.
Yeah.
So I do kind of struggle in talking about my beliefs because I prefer to keep that private.
I completely understand that. I think when I started getting into paganism, I was initially very, I'm generally very open about everything. And I had no problem talking about my thoughts about it or what I was doing, or even the mechanics of the stuff I was practicing. But I do think over time, because it is very personal. It is you're at least for me, it's like the most naked, exposed you can be in a lot of ways.
Quite literally, we get naked in our rituals. I mean,
So it does sort of become, I have become more, I'm fine with talking about it if people ask me, but I'm not necessarily, openly talking about it in public and that kind of thing. Yeah.
Right. I don't find myself being shy about telling people like, I practice Satanism or I'm an occultist, because that is a fact about who I am. But I don't typically like having discussions about theology or about my practices with whoever,
Yeah. Totally understand. Well, let me ask you this then, because as a non-binary person, I've talked a lot on the podcast about how goth has played a role in my gender. And again, this could be one of those things that maybe you don't want to talk too much about, but I would love to hear if or how, I guess, goth has played a part in the way you view gender in general, or your own gender.
Oh, absolutely. I love talking about this shit.
Okay,
so, obviously having a goth dad, I grew up around a man that had super long hair and wore makeup and got dressed up for any excuse. And to me, that was always like the epitome of masculinity. And all of the men that I've looked up to, or all of the people in general that I've looked up to, are people that are not afraid to use fashion and makeup to explore and express their identities. So I've gotten a lot of shit from people that are like, oh, well, you're trans and, wouldn't you want to be like hyper masculine, blah, blah, blah. Like, to me, that's not what makes a man. It's not having short hair and being super buff and, wearing t-shirts and jeans every single day. Like the ability to be comfortable enough in oneself to express that in ways that mess around or break the binary, to me, that is inherently a fairly masculine thing. Like it's hard to do those things and not be comfortable with yourself as a man,
So masculinity is more about a freedom from the strictures of society, where femininity is sort of folding oneself into the box, because that's what, our patriarchy kind of shoves on femininity, where masculinity is supposed to be I'm going to be out there doing my own thing because I am an independent masculine voice.
I wouldn't necessarily say that about femininity in any way, shape, or form at all. I just think, like, from my personal perspective, as a man, and when I'm speaking about this, I'm not like I guess in a way I am. I'm purposefully excluding talking about non-binary or feminine identifying people, because I can't speak for them, and I'm not going to. I'm not going to try. Like, that's not my place. I identify solely as a man, and I'm becoming more comfortable with my androgyny, but I've never identified with being female. I've never questioned if I was non-binary. I've always known I'm a guy. Like, that's never been a question for me. So I don't feel like it's my place anywhere to speak for non-binary or feminine people. So when I say, to me, masculinity is about being comfortable enough to express yourselves in a way that society would typically view as feminine, that's specifically what I'm talking about.
No, I like that, because for me, goth, for me, that androgyny was what sort of was my safe way of expressing gender fluidity without even knowing that's what I wanted. But I do absolutely recognize that a lot of male goths absolutely embodied what you're talking about, and that for them, goth was that expression of masculinity, of showing the world, like, you can express yourself in these ways and be confident in who you are, and that's what being a man is about, and that's what I'm going to do. And so that's really lovely to hear that was sort of an example of that freedom, I guess.
I guess a better way of looking at that dichotomy would be more masculinity versus the concept of toxic masculinity, which is the much more.
I don't.
Yeah,
fuck with
and that's the much more buttoned down.
Right.
you have to be a man kind of bullshit that
Yup.
is very restrictive on the way one can present oneself to a very, very limited idea of what masculine presentation is about. And, your concept of masculinity is much more freeing and open as a counterpoint to that very buttoned down toxic masculinity concept.
Absolutely.
Don't go to a hospital. Die in a ditch. Be a man.
Yep.
I won't go to a hospital because I'm scared of doctors.
Yeah.
But that's a completely different subject.
Oh God. Yeah. I think Trey and I had a conversation about that with a therapist at a goth club once. That was an interesting thing. Well, let me ask you about this then, because you talked briefly in your auxiliary magazine interview about your experience with bipolar disorder. So again, sort of same sort of thing. I'm interested to hear how your experience with BPD has shaped your view of yourself and your interaction with the world.
So I want to make a quick correction really quick.
Sure.
When I say BPD, I'm talking about borderline personality disorder, not bipolar, which I know to a lot of people are very similar.
No.
In my experience, they are vastly different.
Completely different. But
yes,
you're right. A lot
different.
of people don't understand them as different, and also
that's
tend to bundle MPD,
no,
multiple personality, in that as well, which isn't even a clinical disorder technically. But they're kind of all bundled up in this weird confusion in the public mind.
Yeah, I think people really struggle to understand the differences between these disorders and these struggles when they're not actually going through it themselves, or they're not a clinical professional. It's like, oh, this person has a mental illness. That's it, But I'm sorry, not to be rude. Could you go over the question again?
Well, just like, I guess it's sort of a general question about how that's influenced your view of yourself. A more specific question would be if you feel like goth or whatever alternative subculture is more supportive of people that are, I guess, neurodivergent, for lack of a better term, compared to how we're treated by other outside groups.
I would say in my experience, like specifically talking about that part of it, I have noticed quite a big difference in support. And I think it's because a lot of people in alternative subcultures aren't afraid to just be open about everything. And so there's more of a healthy dialogue about these struggles and making awareness of them. But I mean, I guess in my experience, having BPD, even in alternative subcultures and even in my goth community that I'm surrounded by, there's still a lot of people that don't understand it because it's been stigmatized for so long. People hear somebody say, well, I have borderline personality disorder, and immediately they go to, oh, this person's super manipulative. Oh, this person has narcissistic tendencies. This person will like jump off the handle and like has explosive relationships. And it's because for so long, there's been a huge stigma around people with BPD being quote unquote irreparable via therapy or drugs, because it is such a complex condition. And it's completely learned behaviors that stem from childhood trauma. It's not like a chemical imbalance in the brain. And the only way to repair that or to work with that is intensive therapy and treating comorbid afflicts with that. So I don't know. I think for me, I do feel very grateful that I have a lot of people, both online and in person, that are very supportive of it. There's still not an understanding, and that I don't think has anything necessarily to do with the goth culture, other than that I think that the goth culture and people involved in it are more open and understanding of mental illness in general. But specifically talking about BPD, there's still a lot of gray area.
I think, a couple things. I think you could have some fun with categorizing goths as different types of goths. Well, obviously people do have fun with that, but just to speak to goths being very open, it was funny that I have this memory of someone I had never met before. I needed a ride to a club night in Chicago, and she lived in sort of near me. And so I just asked, like, hey, can you pick me up? And on the drive there, she completely unprompted gave me her entire sexual history, her entire trauma history, like all of these, like her ex-boyfriend who had tried to murder her, like all the
like the oversharing.
Yeah, I was like, okay, yeah, I guess that's a thing that goths do. All right, I got it. It's just funny how that works. But yeah, and I think, to speak to sort of the comorbidities thing, I feel like that's a problem with understanding mental illness in general, and we don't have to get into a huge discussion on it, but I think people do still have an understanding of a lot of different mental illnesses as being strictly neuronal deficiencies, or the colloquial sort of miswired, or not enough serotonin or whatever. And I don't think that we work in such a mechanistic way, and we have to recognize that these, like you said, these are complex issues that are related to our history and our environment, and all kinds of different things, our community. People talk about, I can't remember the woman's name, but she talks about PTSD as post-traumatic slave disorder, and how we can't view therapy and depression and dealing with those issues through a one-on-one personal responsibility. I take action and do these coping mechanisms to fix myself, or I take this pill to fix myself. Certainly those things are helpful, but her main thing is there are broader systemic issues that are, and then she talks about disparities in the Black community and redlining, and these things, that generational wealth and generational trauma, and these things that like set people up to fail. So I do think it is important to recognize these issues as being, I don't want to use the word holistic, but more complex and interconnected than. Are
you thinking of Dr. Joy DeGruy?
Yeah. Yes, I think that's correct.
Thank you, Google. But yeah, I've definitely seen stuff like that before, and you're right. Both of you have expressed how it's just so much more complicated than a simple difference in brain function, whether it's very mechanistic, biologically based chemical interactions. But I mean, all of that interacts with the society we live in, the interactions we have with other people, how we frame those interactions in our own thoughts and feelings, and how we've learned and developed to do that framing. And that's, why a lot of, when you talk about treatment of these sorts of things, yes, there's medical treatment when it comes to taking, mood balancing or chemical balancing medications, but that's not a cure, and it's not even perceived as a cure by the people who are prescribing it. It's a way of getting you to a baseline where you can start working on these frameworks, working on how you perceive and interact with society, working on developing more healthy entanglements with the society you live in from a stable baseline that eventually you want to get off of, because that stable baseline has its own problems. Usually it's dampened everything to a way that, sucks a lot out of life. So you want to be able to ease back of that, but you want to have, while in that state, develop that toolbox of, how to perceive the world, how to interact with the world, how to engage with stimuli and frame those stimuli into a worldview that then, when you're back in your naturalistic self, you have a better way of managing that in a way that it's not interfering with your ability to exist in society.
Entanglement is a great word. Just wanted to say that. All right, so let's see. Moving on a little bit here. I don't know if you have thoughts on this, but personally, but in general, goths are, and you sort of touched on some of the ephemera around this, but goths tend to be fascinated by death and dying. And I've done a lot of reflecting on mortality this last year myself. So I'm interested to hear if death has played a role in your experience of goth or the world and your thoughts around that.
Absolutely. My first experience with death outside of like pets that I don't terribly remember very well was my grandfather passing when I was almost 8. It was like right around my birthday. And for a very long time, I didn't understand it. I went through like this weird period in my life where I was like blaming myself for it. And I was like kicking myself for like not going to any of his services because I didn't want to remember my grandfather as a corpse in a casket. So I had a lot of questions that surrounded what is death and how does it work and why does this happen? Why do we need to experience this from a very young, like, you know, child's eyes perspective. And I think that having all of those questions and seeing a culture that was like really embracing of it was something that kind of drew me to it. But I think the more that I grow and the older that I get, the more I come to terms with that I am actually not only very afraid to die, but I'm very afraid to be alive. And goth, in a strange way, is kind of the middle ground in between that. And I think that's probably why I'm like so obsessed with vampires.
Yeah.
But like,
I love what you just said. I just want to say that. Goth being the middle ground, but that liminal space between living and dying. Yeah.
Over like the last 2 years, I think maybe at this point. Yeah, it's coming up on 2 years. I lost my grandmother, who was like my main matriarchal figure. Like she was essentially my mother. And then my biological mother as well. So I've been trying to navigate that and navigating heavy grief that I've never really experienced and trying to come to terms with death in a very blunt way. And I find that to some degree, goth does kind of lend a buffer to that in a weird way that I don't know if I could really put too many words to, but there's definitely an air of comfort being involved in a community that almost celebrates death in a way that's not super drum hum all the time, you know? There's a respect for it.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not a celebrational as an aspirational thing. It's not that we're all fixated on dying, but celebrational.
Although
in that,
I'm Trey, I don't think I could pull an example up, but I think there is a cliche of like the goth sort of nihilist, like I can't wait to die, everyone should be dead, whatever kind of thing. So that is a thing.
I mean,
that's definitely a cliche.
Yeah.
No, I can't deny that hasn't existed. But I find that the general tenor of the idea or the attitude towards death in goth spaces is celebratory in a sense that, you know, we celebrate the natural progresses of existence, and we're willing to confront and face and be present in those times when we're dealing with death and we're dealing with the fear of death, because those are universal things that humans or, you know, any sort of self-aware mortal being, I think, experiences, is this concept of the end and how you deal with that. And in goth spaces, we're all, at least not, I can't say we're all, but there's a general tenor where we're willing to look at that together rather than looking away from it or pretending it doesn't exist as a coping mechanism. Not that we don't fall into that on occasion. We all do that because it can get uncomfortable, and sometimes facing it is uncomfortable too. But I think there's a greater willingness of facing it both in yourself as well as facing it in a way that allows you to be there for people who are experiencing it in a way that's, I think, supportive and constructive, and makes it does help when you're dealing with the trauma of death and dying to have someone who's willing to look at that with you and willing to hold your hand through that experience. And I think that's one thing that I've always found appealing to this sort of goth mindset around death and dying.
Yeah, I really like that idea of seeing goth as this in between, this liminal. I think Isabella Van Elfren has talked about goth in similar ways in some of her books. I think that's something I want to think about more going forward. I think maybe for me that the experience of that is sort of this goth as this because it can be very ritualistic and very both in a personal sense and in a community sense, and in a just being in the world like performative sense, that it is this sort of, and I guess the experience of being the other and being uncanny, because those normative expectations exist, it makes being a goth feel otherworldly in a way, that is sort of this, I guess that's a state that people seek in general through psychedelics or whatever kind of meditation and that kind of thing. And I think that's interesting to think about goth sort of touching on that in a way. I don't think I have anything else to say about it other than that, but I like that idea. Okay, well, let's. I've got 2 questions to end with that are kind of a pair of questions. The general idea was I wanted to use these as interview questions I use in each episode to end the episode with, and whether or not I can actually remember to do that in my ADHD addled brain, I don't know. But the first is to ask what is, if anything, concerning or worrying you about goth right now, and then the second question is the flip side of that. But is there anything about goth that you would change, or you're concerned about its trajectory, or something like that?
I mean, there's always the concern of extreme gatekeeping, and you kind of touched on it earlier, talking about, like the elements of racism that are still prevalent in like all parts of our society, but that, whether we like it or not, does still trickle into alternative subcultures. In a perfect world, I would like to see all of that completely go away. I believe that, alternative cultures should be 110% completely safe spaces for all sorts of people, regardless, as long as you're not hurting anybody, whatever.
Yeah.
But even on, my small portion of the internet, and obviously I can't speak too much on the racism aspect, other than things I've seen friends of mine go through. But, as a member of the queer community, as a trans guy, like, even I've still gotten a lot of shit from other goth creators for being trans.
Really?
Because people just suck. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's so fun.
It blows my mind every time.
Yeah, I'm disappointed every time I hear that.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like I shouldn't be at this point, but yeah, every time I'm like, yeah.
I mean, even if you come from a position where you don't really understand that experience because you don't have any sort of inclination yourself, it doesn't mean you can't let another person live their life in a way that's truly personal, right? It's not
right.
Like you're a trans evangelist trying to turn all people into their opposite gender equivalent, whatever.
Right.
Although I wouldn't say no to that necessarily. I might be into that.
I mean, I'm into trans evangelism when it comes to the concepts of experimenting and bending the strictures and breaking out of those boxes, but not in a way that
I know.
You were born man, you need to be a woman, and you were born a woman, you need to be a man. Everyone needs to switch places.
Right.
Though
I don't think the world would be worse off.
I like the sci-fi books where people learn.
Happened, but
that's where I was going. I like some of the sci-fi books where there's a body swap situation that the end result is building empathy.
Right.
It's not about one is better than the other. It's about understanding it from the opposite perspective, living and existing in somebody else's shoes in a very visceral way that lets you understand what life is like from the other perspective. That perspective taking is important, but that's a very different concept in my mind, at least, from that sort of a trans evangelism.
Right. Speaking about evangelism as well, I do think that there is an issue in the goth community when it comes to religion. I know probably more goths, and granted, I'm surrounded by almost exclusively goth people at this point, but more that are like, oh, well, you need to be into spiritualism, or you need to be an atheist. Like you can't practice Christianity and be goth, and that is so dumb to me.
Yeah.
I just think that there's still a lot of prejudice that needs to be worked out from every angle, multiple angles, and I would, in a perfect world, like to see that not be an issue anymore.
I think some of that comes from the impulse to project your own experience onto others and to say, this is how I experience this thing, so others must experience that also this way, which you see kind of reflected in a bunch of different ways, in a bunch of different places. But yeah, I mean, obviously there are goths of all different religious backgrounds, and just because I experience, for example, when I was a Christian when I was younger and also goth, to me those two things were deeply meaningful, and I was able to make those sort of connections between, okay, this aspect of my religious belief connects to this thematic element of goth, and that makes these two things better for me. And I'm able, when I left Christianity and became an atheist, I did the exact same thing. And when I'm still an atheist but practice some form of paganism, I do the exact same thing. And so you just have to recognize that it's your way of being is not the way everyone else should be.
Right.
Yeah, and there can be an aspect of trauma in it as well, since there's certainly a portion of those strongly evangelical type or strongly goth evangelists that are kicking against Christianity because they had a traumatic experience with Christianity in the past, whether it was being within a Christian, household or Christian community that was unaccepting and traumatized them that way, or whether just existing in the world but near a Christian community that was hostile to their way of being and heaping on abuse and problems there. There's definitely a view that these people were the oppressors in my past. So seeing the oppressor in my safe space, because it's turned into this monolith,
right?
Because that's been your only experience. Like you were saying, Danny, when your only experience is this one way of being, when you see somebody who has that same label, you automatically assume everything, all the connotations of that label, without taking into account that individual's perception of it and their embodiment of whatever that is and how they enact it.
Right. Not to go off on a tangent, and I'm not going to, but I just want to say, if people practice Christianity the correct way, this wouldn't be an issue.
Yeah, that would be a tangent. If yeah, I'm just gonna leave that alone. I'm gonna leave it alone.
Yeah, that would be a long discussion. I both agree and disagree with that, and we'll not go that far into it. I understand what you're saying, and I like that impulse. It's the standard idea of the what would Jesus do, right?
Right.
As portrayed as a very accepting.
We're tangenting. Yes, if you keep talking, I'm gonna have to talk, and then we're never gonna stop.
I know.
Stopping now.
So, okay, well, I do have one thing to add, and there's something I wanted to say about my concerns about goth culture that is not something I've said before, although I guess I can lead into it with something I've said before. Just a thought I had that I wanted to express somewhere, so I'm doing it now. So sorry, everyone. And it's about representation and the idea of representation. And within goth, for example, if we're talking about marginalized communities like people with autism or neurodivergence or people of color, and how that's related to politics and broader systems of interaction beyond goth or beyond microcosms like club spaces. I think I've said before that when we talk about politics of goth, that I think in the 80s there was a lot of leftist activism, Activision, the gaming company.
Blizzard.
Yeah, a lot of leftist activism that vanished during the 90s and 2000s as we moved. God, I can't talk at all. As we moved further on from, I appreciate the help there. Moved further on from punk, and the focus shifted to being dark and spooky and romantic. And I think in that shift, goth became much more neoliberal in a lot of ways. And that idea that goth was apolitical became more common. And then what you saw, I think, was this rise of abusers and bigots, sometimes even fascists, getting into the scene and becoming DJs or bands that were playing a bunch of shows and that kind of thing. The problem in my mind is if goth becomes divorced from and I'm not going to stay on politics for too long, but this is kind of leading into what I want to say. If goth is divorced from politics, then you could be goth even if your ideology supports systems that sustain inequality. And so I think now we're dealing with the consequences of that, with people speaking out about accessibility issues, about cultural expectations around how we're quote unquote supposed to communicate, and why that's difficult or impossible for some people. And then of course goths of color that have been talking about why they feel like goth has been made unsafe for them for a long time. The thing I'm worried about is some of the solutions, specifically the idea of representation being the solution. Because the problem with representation is, and I'm referencing a YouTube video, which I will link in the comments. This is not necessarily an original thought. This put to word a lot of what I had been thinking. The problem with representation is that it's given. So someone else owns the platform and they decide who gets to be represented, rather than the people being represented owning the platform and deciding what to do with it. I think that plays into women DJs I've talked to. I think Andy talked about this a bit on the sexism episode we did a long time ago, where women DJs have said like they just can't play certain nights because the guy who runs the night doesn't like how outspoken they are about some of their guy friends that abused women. So I think the problem of expecting people who don't have, asking people who do have to throw them a bone is the wrong way to go about that. And along with that ownership is the getting into the sort of leftist part of this, is that the production of goods, shifting that to localized communities to produce what they want to consume, which is something goths kind of already do, right? There are lots of independent creators who sew their own clothing to sell, or make jewelry to sell, or subcultural media like zines, like Unobscured, I always use it as an example, which is a goth zine owned by queer folks and people of color. People like William Faith, who I always use as an example, who teaches permaculture. But then often the raw materials are still being outsourced to other places, or the platforms that you sell those products on are still owned by these major corporations. So the flow of capital benefits a system that a small number of people are in control over, and then make lip service to diversity through representation. Now, obviously, we're talking about two different scales of production, right? Between goth production and then Amazon or something. But I think
media consolidation and the control of the means of distribution.
Right. But I do think that, and this sort of goes to Ted Shotsky, going back to that thing, that the systems of those productions are still in essence composed of the same sized bundles of material processes. There's just, when we're talking about stuff outside of goth, there's more of them. But I think what happens is you can still reproduce those capitalist ideologies for organizing labor and communities in smaller communities like goth. And I think we saw this happen with, and I won't name them, but some notable alternative clothing companies and club nights who tried to fix being called out on practices that were racist or fatphobic or hurting people in the community in some way by adding representation rather than addressing the root of the issue. So then what you have is maybe you can see minorities achieve a form of material success or subcultural capital and see themselves represented, but you still maintain the status quo, which is a system that tokenizes minorities and uses them as props to generate white success through, stuff like the model minority myth and exploiting the labor of employees and that kind of thing. So it's that's not something I hear anybody really talk about, that sort of class consciousness thing, at least I hear a few people, there are a few communists in my local scene, but I think it's largely an unpopular ideology. And so it's just something I wanted to bring up and hopefully hear more conversations about in the future.
You made a lot of really good points that I feel kind of awful for not putting more thought into, but I'm definitely going to be pondering this and trying to bring these things up in conversation with the people around me, because I completely agree with you.
Don't feel awful. I'm 10 years older than you, and I'm just thinking about them now. So, no, I really appreciate that. Okay, so then on the flip side of that, to before we sort of point people towards your socials and everything, the last question on a positive note is, what are you most excited about, or what's exciting you about goth and alternative culture right now?
So I guess on like a local level, I'm really excited to see a lot of new faces coming through our spaces, like at the goth club. Like I think every time I go, I meet like at least five new people.
That's awesome.
Whether they're new to the area or like we've had a pretty big influx of like, 19, 20-year-olds that are like, I had a birthday over quarantine and now I can go do things. And
I love that.
It's so cool. Like our local scene is expanding, and that's really awesome to see. I think it's also like on a closer to home level, even for me, is like both of my youngest siblings have come to me and expressed a lot of interest in the goth culture.
Wow.
And we only share one parent, and it was the shitty one. So to me, like, that's dope.
Yeah.
That's super dope. So I think kind of seeing, I guess you could call it a revival, but that spark being ignited in, these up and coming generations, like that to me is super cool. Because when I was first, starting to get onto the scene and I was talking to people and I was meeting people, a lot of them were older and they were constantly talking about how the scene was dying and no one gave a shit about goth anymore. Yeah. And I'm seeing the complete opposite of that, even on a local level. So I'm really excited to see how that progresses and where these new people take the scene and take the culture. And I'm excited to see how it continues to grow and morph. And I have a lot of high hopes, honestly. I do. Like, things are shitty, but there's a lot of really amazing people that are starting to embrace the culture. And I think that, even as young as they are now, and I'm really thinking about my siblings when I say this, but even as young as they are now, like, they are very brilliant and very talented, and they have a lot of power.
That's really encouraging to hear. Yeah, I think that period of time you're describing when people were saying goth was dying there have been many periods of time when people have said that, but I think that was, I remember that the most recent one before maybe like 7 years ago, maybe a little more than that. I don't know. Time has no meaning. It's hard for me to quantify that. But yeah, and part of that is like legitimate, where it's like, well, it's maybe you get priced out of your city, or you have no control. The landlord who owns the building like kicks everybody out or whatever. But part of it too is also like, well, cemeteries are free to visit. Like, why don't you have some people over? So yeah, it's really encouraging to hear that people are being more proactive, and also new people are getting involved. Like, that's the most important thing, I think. All right. Well, I will have links to everything in the show notes for where people can find you and find Second Salem. Are there one or two specific places you want to point people to, or
Instagram and Facebook for the band? Definitely. I don't know how many of your listeners are Michigan local, but it would be really cool. Like, I mean, if somebody were to like come out to one of our shows and be like, "Hey, I heard about you guys through this podcast," I'd lose my shit.
There has to be,
That'd be so dope.
There has to be at least 3 of them.
That would be great.
We've definitely spoken to other Michigan folks
Midwestern
on the show, and there's enough Midwesterners, whether it's Chicago or Indiana, that are within shouting distance.
Midwest people are so sad. There's so many goths here.
Heck, even Toronto is got a fair scene there too.
Yeah.
That's not too bad, not too far from Michigan area.
I think the only other thing that I want to add is that, like, if there's anybody in Michigan that wants to come see us and check us out, our next show is March 11th, and you can find all the information on that crap on our Facebook.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
And
thank you so much for having me.
Go buy Auxiliary Magazine because Gerard looks so fucking cool.
Oh my God, no! I probably read your bit like 6 or 7 times. I was like, wow.
No, let's not.
I was like totally in awe.
I deeply appreciate
you guys.
Thank you so much.
You guys can definitely pitch each other's stuff. It's okay.
What are we pitching?
It's
here?
all the same magazine.
I'm receiving.
You're pitching Gerard, and Gerard's pitching you. That's okay.
So yes, this has been really fun. Thank you so much for hanging out with us. This was quite the pleasure, I will say.
Thank you so much. I don't want to hang up. This has been awesome.
Well, don't hang up because it'll kill the recording. But yes,
okay. I won't do that then.
You will have to hang up at some point. I will tell you at least, or I will hang up on you. Okay, so this month we are reviewing the album of Ruination from the band The Palace of Tears. And just a little bit about the band from their Bandcamp page. It says, the duo's unique alchemy draws upon musical influence as varied as post-punk, gothic rock, shoegaze, ambient, drone, jazz, electronica, soundtracks, and more. The Palace of Tears create their own sonic landscape full of haunting beauty, ghostly, evocative, sensual. Both artists collaboratively bring to the table a plethora of diverse experiences in the creative performance world, with influences from theater, dance, circus, opera, and Butoh. So let's listen to a track from the album. I figured we could play track 2. I was a bit torn, but I thought that might be a good one.
That was all right. Track 6 was probably my favorite, but I thought the back half of the album was a lot stronger than the front half.
It is pretty long, but sure. Yeah, let's go with track 6. Why not? That is Shadows of Whispering Phantoms.
Can
this is actually a lot older an album than we usually review. There's a couple reasons for that. I had not heard of this band before. I was actually turned on to this by Dave Batts during his, he does a Thursday morning stream on Twitch, and he introduced the band by saying this is basically the most goth band ever. And I really enjoyed the song, and we chatted a little bit on his stream about it. And I thought it was also kind of a nice companion album to the Blue Hour, which we talked about last episode, because you have these two bands that are ostensibly within goth subculture, making atmospheric, ethereal sort of music, but who sound completely unique from one another. So I thought having those as sort of bookends would be an interesting compare and contrast, I guess.
Sure.
The first thing that I noticed about the album were the vocals. They are really operatic. It reminded me a lot of the late 90s, early 2000 bands that were blending more of sort of gothic and metal together, like Nightwish and Sins of Thy Beloved and Penumbra. I thought it was really reminiscent of that. And actually beyond just the vocals, I thought there was sort of a distinctly 90s sound to the album, for better or worse. It reminded me a lot of, I didn't go back and listen to these bands, so this is more of sort of like remembering through a fever dream rather than maybe a direct, accurate comparison. But in my sort of recollection, it reminded me of bands like Lacrimosa and Moonspell and Lacuna Coil. And when I say for better or worse, I think when you get to track 4, for example, what was that one called? Let's see. Tears of the Moon. You have some very late 90s sounding synth with some occasional electric guitar. And the synth, I think, doesn't sound very good to me. Just because it is the sound of synths have evolved so much that it just sounds archaic in not a good way, at least to me personally.
It's kind of funny that you're pegging a 90s synth sound as particularly archaic, given their inception in the 70s, or at least their popular inception in the 70s of using synths.
Well, I
agree with what you're saying.
I just
because found it amusing.
No, yeah. Well, that makes sense because you're familiar with 70s music and I'm not. So like I don't have that reference.
Fair.
But yeah, so I think, I don't know how that sort of sound will land for newer listeners. I think it would be interesting to actually talk to people who, like Gerard, actually, it would have been great if he had listened to this. Although maybe he is more familiar with 90s music, I don't know. Because I think there was a span of time where we had, especially in clubs, where you had that sound of music happening. The drum machine on track 5, for example, I thought was sort of the quintessential 90s dark electronica sort of drum track. And that I feel like I've heard a million times before, maybe from Ego Likeness or even Crux Shadows or something like that. But I thought still worked for me. It was a little bare bones in the beginning, but when they started bringing in the swirling guitars that had, I think, more of a more modern sound to them, or at least something that you might hear more often with newer bands like maybe Drab Majesty or something like that. I thought that combination gave the track a unique flavor. But even though the synth was a little bit hit and miss, it still in a lot of ways kind of scratched an itch that I forgot that I had. And when I was listening to the album, it really did make me feel like I was 16 again, and that I felt like I was watching music videos off of a Dancing Ferret DVD that I picked up from Hot Topic, which was a really fun little trip down memory lane. Track 6, was that what we just played? Yeah,
I mean that's what I suggested.
Shadows of Whispering Phantoms. The way I thought of describing that was something I would have when I was 16 absolutely have played on my CD player or my iPod while dressed as a vampire walking around my neighborhood at night in 2001.
But not like the background music of your MySpace page?
Oh yeah. Oh yes, absolutely. Yeah. 100%. But again, I still think it had a modern edge to it that kind of lurked in and out of the track, that kind of came in and out, which gave it enough of a twist that it didn't feel like it was just repeating stuff that I had heard before, which would have, for me, probably been enough to make it a decent album, because it's not a genre that I listen to a lot on my own time. But for people that do listen to that a lot, I think the modern instrumentation that's thrown in there will make it feel fresh. So overall, I think it's a great album. I agree with Dave Batts when he said it's super fucking goth. As Sisters of Monday would say, it puts the capital G back in guano. And I mean that in the most loving possible way. So yeah, if I gave it a rating out of 5, I'd probably give it a 3.5 and say it's definitely something you should go check out.
Cool. Yeah, I agree with a lot of what you said there. I definitely think it does harken back to the 90s, as you said. To touch on your comment on the synths, because I had very similar issues with it. I thought the synth program was kind of boring. It felt a lot, a little bit more like they kind of picked a preset they liked and stuck with it. And I think one of the reasons, I mean, I mentioned earlier that, synth started frankly, they started in the 50s, but really they started in their popular music context in the late 60s, early 70s with the Beatles and like Pink Floyd and stuff. But early synths were very hands-on. It was just a big bank for making sounds and didn't have like presets and all these things. So anybody who used synths actually had to do something unique because there weren't options to have a genericized sound. So at the very beginning, even though it was the most primitive side of it, it probably had the most creativity because of just the sheer amount of work that went into it. And, laying down the cache or getting access to them was also very difficult. So bands that did have that access, whether it's through the studio they recorded in or being independently fucking wealthy enough to afford these giant monstrosities, usually put enough effort into kind of learning it and experimenting with it and doing something interesting and unique. So that's why I'd say the 70s sound is probably the most experimental. Then you get into the 80s, still hardware based, still analog, but there was a rise of presets that were built into them. They were a little bit more manageable. So you had a little bit more genericization when you listen to like the 80s music sound, you kind of hear the same sort of sounds coming in and out of a lot of different tracks from the rise of presets, but it was still a big hardware with all sorts of knobs and buttons. So I don't think very many people were able to resist tweaking things here and there as they were playing. So they still had a dynamism. And then in the 90s, you got the rise of the software synthesizers. And I think that's where you ran into the trap of people just picking a preset and playing it on their MacBook or whatever they had that was doing the background tracks, and just kind of letting it run. There wasn't as much emphasis on tweaking the sounds and making them dynamic. And that's one thing that, I can't say that that's what this band did, but what I felt is they had some semi-stock sounds with some interesting effects that gave them a little bit of motion. So they weren't totally dry. They had some motion, they had some dynamism, but not to the degree I'd like, and not to some of the degree that's become sort of the norm now with the rise of electronica and more of an emphasis on experimentalism within synth programming, because it's become so ubiquitous that people are trying to distinguish themselves by at least tweaking some presets rather than going and just holding to the presets. So, that's sort of one of my critiques. Is I found the synth work to be a little bit boring, though not terrible. It usually was fairly unintrusive, and the sounds were good, but they just didn't seem to evolve. They didn't seem to have any unique character that said, this is a Palace of Tears sound. It was like, these are some cool synth presets that sound okay, but I wanted something a little bit more unique, something more to grab onto from that standpoint.
Yeah.
As far as their album went, I thought it was a little bit weak at the very beginning. I like the first track, which is often always the case with me. For some reason, I guess it's a thing with goth bands, but the first track is almost always some sort of weird experimental music type thing. In this case, it was very cinematic, so it really showed, as they name checked soundtracks as an influence. I think the first track is exemplary of that. It was a relatively short track, all instrumental, but had a nice sort of cinematic feel, a little bit of that soundtrack work, and then some of the ambient stuff they mentioned. And then, the next couple of tracks were good, but just didn't really grab me. Again, the like I said, the synth work was nice, but not that interesting. You also mentioned the drum programming. I agree with you on that. A lot of the drums were they were fine, but it felt like they just put on a drum loop and just let it play as almost a fancy metronome that they were playing along with. There wasn't a lot of dynamism in the drums. Drums weren't coming in and out. There wasn't a division of, here's like the top end cymbals and hi-hats that sort of come in and out to change the dynamism. Here's a kick snare pattern that sort of stays the same most of the way through. Once the drum beat starts, it usually stays playing through the whole track. It doesn't they don't drop the drums to change the feel up a whole lot. So I found that to be a little bit boring, though. I mean, I didn't find the drum beats themselves to be bad. They fit with the music. They were solid. They gave, at least some of the songs a danceable feel, which was nice, but it was definitely more in the goth rock, 90s goth rock feel rather than, say, an electronic feel, or even the more 80s rock, like a Sisters of Mercy drum machine sound, which was more hard to tell it's even a drum machine, because they were definitely doing a rock drummer, but programmed into their friendly doctor.
Yeah.
So that was kind of my feel there. And, like I said, 2, 3, and 4 were all kind of in that same thing. They had some interesting choices with sounds, but a lot of the things, they kind of developed an atmosphere and they just kind of stuck with it the whole way through. It was a good atmosphere, but it got a little bit tiring after, 4 or 5 minutes to me. And I found the lyrics they had some really good imagery, but I felt a lot of them needed a little bit more development. They were pretty short. So I kind of read through the lyrics, and the first couple of tracks didn't grab me that much. So I thought track 2 had some interesting imagery that I kind of liked. That was really short lyrics. So I kind of wish they developed those ideas a little bit more.
Yeah.
But yeah, they definitely have a lot of influences that I was hearing of that sort of 90s goth rock sound, the sort of very electronic goth rock that was popular in the 90s. But then later on, especially around track 6 and 7, the shoegaze element really came in. That's part of what drew me to those, is they really sort of changed tone. They brought in a heavier emphasis of the sort of wall of sound electric distorted guitar that harkens back to like a My Bloody Valentine kind of shoegaze feel. I really felt that was a neat change of pace that added a lot more dynamism to their sound. So I really enjoyed the latter half of the album. I thought they did more interesting things musically. The drum beat was still, I think their drum program was probably the weakest element of their work here. The synth work was also okay, but with the added emphasis of the guitars mixed in with that, it fell into more of a background element that didn't bother me as much as when it was foregrounded. So yeah, overall, I did really enjoy the album. I thought it was pretty good. Not as good as the previous one that we were bookending this with. That was an excellent album that we both quite loved, but this one was good. Definitely enjoyable. I do recommend checking it out. I'd probably give it a 3 out of 5. Particularly a lot of it was just, it was hard for me to get into it initially because I didn't really care for the first few tracks other than the very first track. But then the back half really did redeem it, and I really enjoyed that a lot more. But I think it could use a little bit more dynamism in the drums, maybe just instead of just letting them play, cut them out in bits and pieces to change the feel a bit. I thought the vocals were good. They were sort of one note. The vocalist had a sound that they stuck with the whole way through, and that was fine. It was a pretty operatic, but in that sort of goth sense of being very detached too, pretty, but not heavily emotive and dynamic, sort of very cold and detached with that full operatic sound, which I like, but I do tend to like vocalists with more character and more dynamism in their presentation. And the lyrics were good, like I said, but it would key on some interesting pieces of imagery and then not really develop it that much. Agree. So I figured they could use some more development in some of the imagery. A couple of the early tracks had a bit too much focus, I think, on rhyming words that I thought on a couple occasions felt a little bit forced. But overall, I thought they had some really good ideas lyrically and some good images. I just wanted to see them more developed and maybe some more experimental in structure and rhyme scheme, and don't worry about that as much to make sure some of the lines rhymed. Not really a big deal if you've got powerful imagery to work from.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's kind of my feel to it, but I enjoyed it. Definitely check it out.
Very good. Let's move on to sinister suggestions. Do you have anything? Do you want to go first this time?
I really don't.
Okay, that's fine. I was struggling as well. So I've been watching a sci-fi show called Killjoys, which I liked. I know I recommended a show called Black Matter a long time ago, and it's kind of similar to that. It's been a really kind of shitty month overall that has kept me away from doing anything. I can, though, talk about the 4 hours of Elden Ring I've played so far. Just to share a few thoughts on this for the 10 people that care. So I am a huge From Software fan. I've played all their games multiple times. I've watched all of their games played by other people multiple times. I've read all the lore and everything. I'm a big fan. I was a little worried about this game because, well, the hype was huge, but also it's open world. And one of the things I really like about the From Software games are they're not linear, but the areas that you go through are set up so that the enemy placement is strategic. So there's an aspect of thinking through how you're going to engage each encounter. And I feel like that kind of goes out the window with open world games. So like I said, I've only played 4 hours. I felt like the game starts off really strong. There are a lot of fun references to From Software tropes and fan service in a way that I think is beneficial to the game, unlike how the fan service appeared in Dark Souls 3 for anyone who played that. I don't think it really worked in that game. I think it felt too fan servicey. But the open world segment at the beginning of that game, to me personally, and I know this is the highest reviewed game From Software game of all time, and maybe it was the highest reviewed game of all time, I don't know. For me, the open world part did feel kind of overwhelming, and it sort of directs you where you're supposed to go. When I would go off in a different direction, everyone talked about how rewarding it was supposed to be, but I don't know if I'm missing something. And again, I haven't played that much, but it kind of felt like there are some cool enemies and character designs that are incredibly difficult to fight, but felt like that was about it. And it didn't feel as satisfying as fighting difficult enemies when you know that you're progressing through a narrative, because when you're progressing through like a linear area, you're working towards something and there's storytelling going on with, like, you know, if you go back to Demon Souls, the first area, you have this big castle and there's dragons there, and you're sort of, as you're progressing through it, you're figuring out, okay, who laid siege to this castle, what happened here. And so there's environmental storytelling, but I feel like when you're out in this open world, there's less of that, and maybe that just kind of happens later on. So I wasn't super impressed with that, but as I am getting now into the more linear areas and sort of following the path that you're supposed to go, I am enjoying it more and more, and it's feeling more like what I wanted the game to be. It is very difficult. My wife got it. Everybody had said this is supposed to be the most accessible game, and it definitely is for a From Software game. Like if you've never played a Dark Souls game, or Sekiro or Bloodborne, this is the most forgiving and gives you the most options to engage with the game, and a lot of the mechanics are more forgiving in a lot of different ways, but it's still hard as fuck. So don't expect to just pick it up and play it like a normal RPG. It is still a very difficult game. Mm-hmm. So I am enjoying it and optimistic, and I've got a whole like 70 or 80 hours ahead of me, so we'll see what happens before then. But I think I can still give it a tentative recommendation. To if you think you're interested, I think it would be a good idea to pick it up.
So what's been your average minutes per death rate on the game in those 4 hours?
Well, it's kind of, so the problem is when you get out of the tutorial area, basically, then you're in the open world. Mm-hmm. And you can follow the path you're supposed to go. You can go off in a bunch of different directions, or right out of the gate, there's this, From Software does this in all their games, there's a mini boss. Mm-hmm. And you're not supposed to fight the mini boss. It's there. It will kick your ass. You're supposed to come back to it later, but technically you can fight it and kill it if you're good enough at the game. And I'm very stubborn.
Oh, okay.
So I spent a good hour and a half trying to kill this mini boss, and I got very close, and I did not kill it though. So that also maybe slightly frustrated me for the beginning of the game as well, and maybe tainted a little bit of that, because by the end of it, I was so mad that I had to move on, just frustrated that I hadn't done it, even though you're really not supposed to be able to.
Right, but it's there. It's an aspirational goal, and
yeah, like I played really Dark Souls before. I should be able to do this, you know.
The arrogance of those who thought they got good.
Yeah, exactly. So, but I mean, really, that's a really sort of unsatisfying, sinister suggestion. But honestly, you know, I got this new book, Say My Name in Black and Gold, which is about the Sisters of Mercy. I just got it yesterday. I haven't read that yet. It's just been a bad month for free time. So.
Who's that book? Who's it by, and what's the relationship with the band itself? So I kind of saw you post on it. I didn't look into it yet, but I just saw the post quickly and hadn't really looked at anything up about it.
Rough Trade. It came from Rough Trade.
Okay.
And this one is by Mark Andrews. Mark Andrews is from Warwickshire and has lived and worked in the UK, Egypt, and now Belgium. He is an author of a series of long articles for The Quietus on the early years of the Sisters of Mercy. He has also written for the Middle East Times, Bangkok Metro, Flanders Today, and Louder.
Okay, so a music journalist is
yes.
What it sounds like. A music journalist that probably is also a Sisters fan, given he's got a past history of writing articles about the Sisters.
Yep. You know, I bought it in my pursuit of having the largest goth library of anyone else. So there's a new book about goth. I had to buy it.
I mean, you're definitely progressing on that pathway pretty effectively, I'd say. I don't know what the bookmark is for goth libraries. I know mine is pathetic. but slightly growing. I don't really have much either. I've not been consuming a lot of new media. I mean, we were discussing earlier some anime, and you'd recommended some that I believe you said your brother had recommended you.
Yeah.
I did watch Jujutsu Kaisen.
Mm-hmm.
That are the other words or the other way around. I never quite couldn't remember which way
I think
it is.
That's right.
But so I did watch Jujutsu Kaisen. I thought it was very interesting. It was a good anime. It's been getting a lot of recommendations in the anime community about great action scenes, and it did have good action scenes, but that's not really what interested me about it. I thought it sort of dealt into ideas of, what makes a good guy, what makes a bad guy. What are the various reasons for people to be in those positions, whether it's, I want to be a good guy because I'm a good guy. I want to be a good guy to avenge the people who are hurt. I want to be a good guy to help the people who can't help themselves. I want to be a good guy because it nets a paycheck. And then, same thing for bad people. I want to be a bad guy because I like to hurt people. I want to be a bad guy because the world hurt me and I want to get back at them for it and teach people a lesson. So it has a lot of this sort of dynamic looking at both sides of that. I thought that was interesting. And then it had an interesting with, semi superpowered mystical characters fighting otherworldly entities and having special, I specialize in this sort of energy projection and I manage my energy this way and different power sets that I find intriguing. And I like how shows pick that up and how they play with the ideas of, here's my power set, but here's the creative things I can do with it too. So I felt it did a little bit of that, which was kind of fun. But yeah, overall, I thought it was a good series, but it's still in the midst of things. So I finished up the first season, which is all there is, I believe. And it kind of leaves you hanging. So it's not a good binge watch if you want completion, but it's enjoyable if you're wanting to get into a series. There's a manga too. So if you really want to see more of the world, you can definitely dig into the manga, which is of course farther than the anime is as far as the story is concerned, like they usually are. So it's a good series. I would recommend it if you're into anime. And then on the gaming front, I may have recommended this on the channel, on the podcast before. It would have been years and years ago when I first started playing it, but I just got back into the game Kenshi, which is another open world, very open world. You had mentioned Elden Ring being an open world, but this is the type of open world I like, where you're given a character or some characters at the beginning of the game, and it's just live the life. There's no real overarching story or quest or guide. You just kind of start in a town. It has a handful of different starting conditions at different levels of difficulty, from, hey, I'm a successful trader and I've already got like a pack animal and some trade goods, and I start in a city and can just sell and get going, versus I've got nothing and I'm a slave in a camp and I need to figure out how to survive and escape the slave camp before I can even do anything. So it's got a lot of dynamic storytelling, but it's emergent storytelling is kind of the thing. You create your own story, but you start out, it's a far future post-apocalypse that most people have forgotten what the technology is. There's a lot of broken technology, though there are still sentient robots that exist and are playable characters, as well as things like that if you want. But nobody really understands it. It's got a semi-medieval Asian feel, with samurai and katana and things like that, but in a distant post-apocalyptic future with mysterious technology and things like that. And you start up, you need to buy and sell things, equip yourself. When you start, you are a nothing character for the most part. You go up to anybody, go up to like a starving farmer, and they'll beat the shit out of you. So you definitely have to work your way up. You can develop a squad of characters by purchasing people or meeting people that want to join up with you, so you can manage a squad of people. You can get pack animals that can help you carry your stuff as you loot things to sell and make money, so you can pay to buy more characters or equip your characters, or most often important, to buy food, because you do have a hunger system and you need to eat food. So starving is always an issue. But it's hard. It's got sort of the Elder Scrolls skill progression style system where you gain abilities, not through leveling, but through using them. You just, as you use, your crossbow, you get better at using crossbows. As you carry around heavy loads and run really slowly because of it, you also gain strength. As you run around, you gain athletics. And as you get the shit beaten out of you, you gain toughness. So it's kind of that dynamic. There is no leveling system. It's just you use the skills to get better at them. And there's a lot of, you go out, you get beaten up, you get left half dead, you crawl your way back to town, you heal up, and you're a little bit tougher for the next time you meet something. Eventually you get tough enough to start taking things on, can start building up a little army. But it's a fairly rough and unforgiving game. There's a lot of getting beat down and crawling back to town. Death actually doesn't happen it's not that easy to die, I guess. I mean, you can die, especially if you're taken out by animals, because a lot of the animals will just eat you, and there's no coming back from that. But most people, if you're killed by other people, they'll just rob you of your stuff and leave you in a ditch bleeding. But usually enough to recover and crawl back somewhere safe and recover, as long as you have access to some manner of food and don't starve to death. I find it really interesting. I like those very open world emergent games. As I recommended Star Sector previously. It's similar, but not in space. But yeah, it's a fun game. Definitely another very independent game. It's not the prettiest of games out there. It's got some serious graphic issues, but it's a top-down 3D-ish type game. It's a good game. I've been enjoying it, but I just picked it back up again after watching after falling over a couple of Let's Plays that kind of brought it back up onto my radar. So if you like that very open, emergent gameplay type game, it's a recommendation. If you want to have a story and you want to have a linear progression, don't bother. It's not good for that sort of play style.
With that, we're going to wrap up another episode of Cemetery Confessions. We will be back next month with another episode with La Carmina. We're going to be talking about primarily traveling and how to travel as a goth, and tips and tricks. I think we'll also be talking a bit about goth in other countries and some other random fun things. So I think it'll be a good time. If you haven't, please subscribe. Check out our Patreon over at patreon.com/Cemetery Confessions for other bonus content. And until then, stay dark.
The preceding program is a member of The Belfry, a network of blogs, podcasts, and videos for the darkly inclined. Go to thebelfry.rip for more information.